This story happened when I was around 10 years of age and involves four of my childhood friends. In case you didn't know, I'm a 28-year-old female and I'm from a very country southern state. This was the most awful thing that I've been through in my life. This takes place in the mountains. I was always so excited to see the weekend approaching, partly because I had a pretty cool mum who would take me places with my friends and pretty much let us have a little freedom. Other part is I always got to spend the weekends with my friends, so my best friend, Felina, asked if she could come spend the weekend with us. I asked my mum, who says yes. I waited until her mum dropped her off at the bottom of my hill and walked down to meet her. We walked excitedly back to my house. My mum then said her best friend Chris, called and asked if we wanted to come up to the mountain house where they lived for a visit. So my mum asked Felina and I wanted to go. We both replied with yes. Chris, kids and Alan and Jay. So we left our house within 10 minutes and descended for their home. As I said, they live on top of a huge mountain that is very densely forested for miles and miles. So after 20 minutes of driving, we finally made it to their home. My mum went in and was greeted by Chris. Belina and I went out to talk to Alan and Jay, who also had a few friends with them. We knew everything there and walked to them. Scott being the oldest, Jay the second oldest, Ray and then Alan being the youngest. They all kept going on and on about this cabin that they had built far out in the woods. It was probably about 3 miles into the forest from their house. The boys wanted to take us down to explore it. We agreed. I was used to roaming half of these woods and I always loved venturing into them. I grew up there my whole life. That all changed after this though. We then told my mum and used the bathroom before we went. They sniggered, jumped onto their ATVs, screamed that they're going to be ahead of us, and told us to follow them when we're done. We then get into the house, use the restroom, and ask my mum if we could go. We're in a hurry to catch up with the boys and she says yes, but to be careful. So we raced out of the house. We start walking down their hill to descend to the main dirt road. We had to walk approximately half a mile to get to the road that led to the cabin. It was mostly downhill, except for the flat main bottom road. We skipped merrily along, talking about the guys as we're going. They always liked playing pranks and jokes on me since I was their sister and grew up with them. So I told Belina that I had a feeling that they're gonna jump out and scare us or something. Little did I know, I was in for a different surprise. We walked about another mile to finally reach this cabin. It felt like it took us forever, as this wasn't a road but a path. Sorry that I didn't elaborate more on the road, but this happened a very long time ago and I don't remember it all. When we finally reached it, no one was at the site. We walked onto the little porch and knocked on the door, waiting for one of the guys to jump out and try and scare us. We stepped back and marveled at the little cabin. Jay did a really good job on it. He was always into building and creating and growing things. We finally checked the door and stepped into the little room. The cabin only had 2 rooms. It wasn't very big at all. No one appeared to be inside or in the general area. All we can hear are the sounds of wildlife. As we stood there for a moment trying to figure out what to do, we then heard the ATVs a little way above the cabin, not back towards the main road but further down the path. We followed the sounds and finally see the guys. They're speeding off down the path. Stop long enough to yell at us to keep following them and take off down the path of the woods. We both groaned very loudly. Belina expresses concern and just wants to go back the way we both came to our house. It was probably around 3 in the evening and she didn't want to be out in the woods anymore. I, on the other hand, I was a little explorer. I wanted to keep going down the path, thinking somehow we could just find the guys and possibly prank them. Boy, do I regret that now. In fact, I should have kicked their butts for this little escape. So we take off further down the path and I ended up talking Belina into it. We walked for like 2 hours before we both realised that we're lost. We come to a fork in the road and there stood a tree with 2 arrows pointing to either side of it on a split road. I forget to mention that it was summertime and the daylight was long. It doesn't get dark here until around 8ish in the summer. We had walked for probably about 2 hours in total so far, and seriously didn't know which direction to go. My friend started to panic a bit, and I calmed her down, assuming that we still had plenty of daylight ahead, and affirming this to her, and that we would make it back with plenty of time to go, although I wasn't so sure of that. Now we're about 7 miles into the woods, and there were endless, at the time, trees, so we didn't really know exactly where we were. So we both decided to stick to the right of the mountain, and we took off. Belina was laughing and saying she was going to kick our butts later. I laughed and we made plans to get them back. We walked for what seemed like forever and somehow ended up back on the split road again. It was now growing a little darker, nearing dusk with every minute. But by this time, we realised that we probably were going to get stuck out in the woods. By this point, I was just as scared as she was. At that time, we stood frozen to the road trying to figure out where to go next. That's when about 15 yards back, I heard a twig snap. I then shushed Belina and asked her if she heard it also. She started smiling and was about to call out for the other guys, and I suddenly stopped her, told her to stay quiet for a minute. We continued to hear these footsteps. For some reason I felt more terrified than I ever have in my life before. I whispered for Belina to start walking slowly down the left fork. The footsteps then began inching closer and closer towards our location. It was really strange. We tried to be as quiet as we could, but leaves were all under us. For some reason I knew that these footsteps didn't belong to our friends. I had this awful feeling of dread, and my friend started to pick up on that also. As the footsteps started sounding closer and faster, I decided to book it down the path as my friend followed. I just felt I was running for my life and that if I slowed down, I wasn't ever going to make it back or go home again. We finally reached the embankment on the side of the path, so we decided to climb up it. I tore into the mountains with my feet, my legs, and scratched myself along the way. We could finally see the barn up ahead of us, which was old and had not been used in a very long time. The footsteps still approached us after a short pause. My guess is that they were quieter as they reached the mountain. Also, we had done descending into the tall grassy fields, which made it easier to mask any sounds. As I realised our surroundings, I remembered their family graveyard was up ahead of the barn. It was very old and had very old headstones. I decided that this was our best chance to hide and get a view of whoever it was chasing us, so we ran through the iron gate and hid behind the largest tomb we could find. It grew very quiet and almost eerie as we stood frozen. My mind was racing, my body shaking, my heart was beating out of control. Who was chasing us from the woods? Why did they want us? I had so many questions. Questions that may never actually be answered. Belina and I sat there for what seemed like an eternity, but it was more around 10 minutes. It gave us a chance to calm down, control our breathing, and cool down from our run. We finally decided to stand up halfway so that we could see if anyone was around us. We crept up to our feet, still crouching behind the grave. What we both saw next literally made us pee our pants. There, at the beginning of the cemetery, stood a man, probably about 6 feet tall, appearing to weigh about 170 pounds and wearing very dark clothing. His eyes looked very dark and wild. He stood there, searching the graveyard with his eyes. almost like an animal hunting its prey, trying to listen for us. We both immediately ducked back behind the stone. We both started breathing heavily again, scared to death. He then saw us rise up again. Belina shot me a look as the man started rustling around. I peered up and met him in an eye gaze. He then turned his body towards our hiding place, looked at me and gave me a wicked smile, and then said, "There you are." I didn't even hesitate. I screamed to Valina. We both jumped up and started running towards the back of the cemetery fence. The man chased us down. Luckily for us, this cemetery had a very short fence, so we hurriedly hopped over it and began to run in the direction of the house. We ran out of the clearing and reached the gravel road. We didn't slow down, stop, or look behind us. We just ran as fast as we possibly could towards the house. The gravel was very loud beneath our feet. We made it part ways there, and at the bottom of the road, the boys all stood there looking very worried. We ran out to them so fast that we jumped up. I ran into Scott's arms, crying, with Belina right beside me. She was crying too. Both of us looked an absolute mess, bleeding from the climb earlier, sweaty, and our appearance was of being very shaken. We suddenly turned around and remembered the reason for all the panicking, to see a man running back towards the graveyard, Scott, Jay and Alan all screaming and chasing after him. We never saw him again. The boys chased him into the woods and couldn't catch up with him, so they came back and walked up the house. They all started crying, feeling bad for trying to mess with us earlier. Our parents waiting on us, scared to death. Jay and the boys admitted to leaving us and taking off in the woods, thinking it was funny and that we would find our own way back. As it grew later, they all began to worry about us and had went back to search for us and couldn't find us. They went to all of our parents and admitted what they had done, then they all went out searching for us and started to panic when they couldn't find us. Chris was actually on the phone with 911 when we arrived, about to send a search and rescue for us. We had been gone for close to 5 hours. We told them about the man who followed us, and the police wanted us to give a description of him. They searched through the woods and mountains, but there wasn't a trace. The boys all then got grounded for playing their tricks. They honestly were all shook up about it though, thinking that they'd never see us again, scared because it was getting dark and the man. They felt guilty thinking about him and thought it was all their fault. Needless to say, we forgave them. I never went back to that cabin, or them woods for that matter, again. Back in December of 2012, I received a notice from the manager at the grocery outlet that I worked at that we would be getting a new member of the overnight crew, scheduled to be in the following night. The crew, who consisted of myself and several others, all worked together for quite some time and we all grew into really good friends, so the next night it's myself and 2 others scheduled when the new guy comes in. I already knew this guy to be by the name of John. I'll just change it for this story's sake. So I immediately went up to introduce myself and all that jazz before showing him around and telling him exactly what was expected to happen at any given night. Surprisingly, he seemed to be quite a quick learner. Not that that stuff is too complicated, but it can be a bit tricky at first. But he never asked any questions or made comments, almost acting as if he even knew what he was being told or he wasn't interested. Being the supervisor, I was pretty much the authority, but I never used it. Now, while working there, everybody was used to a loud atmosphere as we play music and yell a lot. It helped us keep us awake and somewhat energized. As time went on, I tried to break him in, but John didn't seem interested, preferring to work alone and not take part in our antics. As time went on, his work began to falter. Soon, he began to slow down and disappear to the back of the store for a while, doing whatever, then returning for an hour or so later. But I always figured that he was being productive, so I just left him alone. What did surprise me though was that John would use a box cutter. He wouldn't cut off the tape, but instead he would stab the boxes and rip them open. I told him to be careful, but he merely shrugged at me every time. One day the manager called me and asked me to talk about how John's been doing at night. I told him about how he becomes slower with work and he seemed much less interested, seeming to do the bare minimum to get by. He suggested that we should talk and I agreed. 3 nights later, it's just Mark and myself on the schedule. After doing the usual stuff for a while, it was finally break time. We decided to walk over to the gas station / convenience store nearby and buy some stuff for our lunch break. As we got back, I noticed that the entrance door was left open. Oh, that's not good. Someone must have forgotten to close it. Mark said that he did. That's odd. We then head inside and continued working until our lunch break. We were sitting in the break room and ended up chatting when we both simultaneously heard something that sounded like one of those freights moving. It was really weird. It didn't make sense why we heard it. It happened again shortly after there. So I got up and checked it out and Mark stayed inside the break room. I go out to the sales floor and notice that one of the freights had been moved a few feet away from where it had originally been left, as some merchandise had fallen over and was laying on the ground. I began picking stuff up and I then heard Mark call my name. I was completely used to yelling, so I just casually walked back towards the room to meet up with Mark. He pointed towards the emergency exit and said that somebody had just walked out, but the alarm didn't go off. I jogged up to peer outside and saw nothing. At first I thought this was some kind of joke. I laughed it off and told him to stop messing with me, but he insisted. I then walked out and around the store but saw no one. I came back in through the front entrance and met up with Mark once again near the break room. What did scare me though was when Mark and I walked to the emergency exit. Mark suddenly turned around and saw someone walking. He nudged me and I had just turned around to barely see the person walking towards the freezer and around the corner, which was all the way on the opposite end of the backside of the store. I ran to catch up with whoever it was, but I didn't see anyone when I turned the corner. The freezer was locked, so whoever it was couldn't have gotten inside unless they had a key, but I had the only one. Mark came up to me and asked me if I believed him now. I said I did. We could be in the store, but how did they get in? I had then thought of the left open entrance from earlier, the fact that the emergency exit alarms were disabled. It must be someone who either works here and is aware of our movements in the alarm system or something. We headed back to the sales floor to investigate some more. Nothing had been knocked off or anything. It was just weird. I walked up near the front entrance and peered out of the window towards a parking lot and again saw no one. By then, as I turned towards the front entrance, I saw someone walking from the parking lot to the back side of the store. This time, I recognized who it was. It was John. What was he doing here? He's not supposed to be working. I yelled out for Mark, who came up to me as I told him that John's outside and he's heading towards the backside of the store. He nods and runs off while I follow. We waited by the emergency exit for about 5 minutes, but John never entered. I then yelled out to Mark that he should head to the sales floor while I stayed back there. I could hear him run off as I stayed by the emergency exit. Out of nowhere, I turned around and suddenly saw John standing about 20 feet from me with a box cutter in his hand. I just watched as he stared at me. How did he end up behind me? I asked him what he was doing there and said that this wasn't funny. He didn't seem to pick up on it though. Finally, when he did move, it was to position the box cutter in an upwards cutting like position, like he was going to stab me across the chest or something, but he eventually lowered it and spoke to me. Tell the manager I quit. He then put the box cutter in his pocket and walked towards the opposite end, once again towards the freezer, and turned the corner, disappearing. This is one of the scariest experiences that I've ever had. Here it goes. At the time I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was literally with large forests everywhere. Almost every house had acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was very beautiful. I'm now 21 and living in a bustling city in Alberta, so I do sometimes find myself missing the setting in my old backyard every once in a while, but it's usually accompanied by the unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in 4th grade, I was already trusted to be home alone by myself as my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunts, who literally lived a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child and my father worked in another province, months at a time, so I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night, exploring the forests. This night I was exploring the woods. I usually never went too far in, usually upon a rock formation that I like to climb and look out through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. I felt like I was on my own private place that only I could enjoy. So I was scaling the rocks and I sit in my usual spot. I suddenly hear something coming in from further. It wasn't a sound that was natural at all. It was crying. Faint crying. It sounded like it was a child or maybe an infant, but just off. It was relentlessly crying. I was more puzzled than scared, since crying was the last thing that I expected to hear while in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced that my ears were playing tricks on me. But it was in fact crying. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest and needed my help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother to help, but then I worried that the girl would have wandered further beyond earshot. I decided to try and locate it myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out exactly where the crying was coming from. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought, and it was a matter of trial and error, even making sure I was going in the right direction. One thing I realised as I was doing all this was how consistent the crying was. No pauses, no words of any kinds, just non-stop wailing that had no end. When I did notice, when I got closer to the sound, it sounded more metallic to me. I eventually reached a small clearing that had only a few trees and branches and nothing else. I had never gone in this far before, so this was my first time that I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the location of the source. There was a grey tape player recorder, one of the biggest I'd ever seen. It was peeking out of one of the bushes and the crying sound was coming out on the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I'd went in all the way expecting to find a real person, but there was only a tape recorder. I was about to shut it off and I heard another sound coming just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady steps, advancing towards my direction. It only took seeing a tall shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognised my way back by identifying rocks and trees as landmarks. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back, and I didn't try listening to see if the person was following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home, nothing else, just get home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way out without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran to my house, locking the door and shutting all of the lights off as I went to my bedroom. I didn't want the person to know where I lived, or I would really be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked out through them discreetly as I could, just to see whoever had been out there that had actually made them sounds, just making sure that they hadn't catched up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed out by that window for a good hour, waiting for someone to emerge out of the forest shadows, but nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never told my mother about what happened that night. I also never had the nerve to be able to go back into that forest again. When I was younger, camping was my absolute favourite thing to do, and my favourite person in the world to go with was my dad. So, me and my dad always went camping, but especially in the summertime. We loved to camp then just because we lived so close to a good camping site. Well, our house was kind of in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by lots of trees, and basically it was a forest, but it was great for camping. One night we decided that we would leave just like we normally did, so that way when we get to the spots it's just becoming morning and we avoid the intense midday sun. That way it made it far easier for us to set up camp and stuff. There was one particular location that we really liked that had a body of water. My dad liked it especially because we could use the water for cooking and stuff, so that would save us fresh water that we had to use for drinking. So we began walking off during the night. We couldn't really think of anything to do, so we just started telling stories to each other. My dad started on some ghost stories, and obviously being a child, these scared me to the death. But I loved listening to them. I was so young and innocent, it was just great. We kept on walking and the moonlight was helping guide us. We had to be very careful where we walked because obviously there were other animals, but that didn't matter so much because my dad had his gun. And obviously I couldn't touch it, but it made me feel so much safer knowing that he actually had that on him at all times. Now the only situation that we had before that scared us was we were camping one night and we saw flashlights. My dad said that he might go and investigate, but decided that it would be better if he just laid low and let them pass. Now it was a very intense few seconds while we were actually waiting for them to pass, but eventually they did and we heard nothing of it from then. Well, that was the most scary encounter that I ever had with my dad, but my dad had one more scary thing that happened to him. While he was out camping on his own, he heard what sounded like lots of screaming sounds coming from the distance, but he just couldn't figure out exactly where it came from. He still had no idea what they were to this day, and he almost didn't ever go back to the forest because of how much it scared him. I know that after that he bought his gun, and that's the same one that he has on him now. Now I know for a fact that this must have really scared him because he's not the type to just go out and buy a gun. In fact, he was strongly against them at one point, and he's tough as nails anyway. So I couldn't see why he'd got one initially, but it was only later when he told me about that story that I then finally fully understood, even in my young age. So we continue walking in the moonlight. My dad decides to turn on his flashlight because how rugged the ground was, and the last thing that you want to do is break your ankle or twist it out here. Mostly because that with all the trees, there's no way that an emergency helicopter can land and rescue you. The only way that people can actually come back and find you is by trekking on foot, and that can take hours, especially travelling as far in as we were. As we were going, we didn't encounter any other people like we usually didn't. I did stop for a second because I thought I heard a screaming sound. My dad instantly looked very scared when I said this. He stopped and I did, and we both just listened. There it was again, but even more faint. I looked at my dad and he still had a concerned look on his face. He then crouched down and started looking through his scope, just to see if anything was there. I noticed how sweaty his hands were. Now, with all the ghost stories that we had just been talking about, I was terrified that there was some kind of ghost or monster that was about to come and get us. Looking back on it now, my dad was obviously far more worried about people coming, but to be honest, I even wonder if he thought it was something else out there. When you're that far away in the woods, away from everyone else, and it can be so quiet but loud at times, it's a really scary feeling. Just how overbearing the trees are can put chills into you at night. Some of them are so thick that you can't even see the moonlight. After a few more seconds of crouching down, the noise finally stops and my dad agrees that it's time for us to go. So we both get up and start moving, only this time we're moving a lot faster than we did before, and we're more quiet, taking care. Now, even though my dad was very tough, I was still very scared, because when you see the person who's meant to be the strongest being scared, it's very unsettling. I said to my dad, "Do you think this is a ghost?" and he didn't answer. I knew now it is my time to be quiet. And we kept on walking further into the night, and eventually we began to ease off and he put his rifle back onto his shoulder. Not in a position where that he could fire it instantly like he was for most of the walk. By now it was still dark. Not only that, there was a mist forming. This scared me more than anything, because I said to my dad that this is certainly a sign of ghosts coming. He still looked very concerned and got his rifle back again, and I also felt fear again. We continued walking and my dad eventually said that we're gonna have to stop for the night, we can't keep on walking forever. I'm pretty sure we're far enough away from whatever that is now, and I've got my gun. So, after about an hour we finally set up our camp, and we also set up a fire. My dad said that it's very important to have a fire for heat and keeping animals away. I very carefully listened because I loved learning and listening from my dad. As I was sitting with him, we started cooking some food, and he then told me that story about the weird screaming sound he had heard before, and why that he had his rifle. I wasn't so scared when he told me this time. I was more understanding. It was very weird though, just to see how concerned my dad looked. I think telling the story scared him so much that he said that we should go to bed. So we finished our food and gone into our tent and cut the light off. I was struggling to sleep because of all the ghost stories that my dad was telling me. I was almost certain that someone was going to come down and take me away. It was a really scary feeling to have, knowing that there's nothing protecting you other than maybe a millimeter of fabric on the tent. I eventually did drift off to sleep, however. I don't remember much of my dream, just that I didn't get very good sleep. After about half an hour into my sleep, I was awoken. I didn't know what had woken me up at the time. I just kind of laid there with my eyes open. You know, if you ever get woke up in the night and you kind of need to know what's going on? Yeah, that. So I laid there for ages. I didn't hear anything, but then I heard it. Surely I didn't hear it. I thought I heard that same screaming sound that I heard earlier again. So I stopped again and I didn't hear it for ages. And I thought that maybe it's just in my head, and I started to go to sleep again. Then I heard that same sound again, but this time it was even closer than before. Dad, shh. My dad was already awake. I didn't realise at the time, but he already had his rifle loaded. Then I heard that screaming sound again. It was getting even closer. And my dad whispered to me that I had to stay still and as silent as possible. There was no need for him to tell me that twice, and I laid there, terrified, and I began shaking, and my dad put his arm around me to comfort me, and I began to shake a little less, but I was still petrified. I couldn't move. I went to tell my dad that we shouldn't have to worry, but I was literally petrified to the point that I couldn't speak. The screaming sound got even closer. My dad gripped his rifle even harder. Then there was another sound. It sounded like an animal screaming this time. The main sound that we could hear wasn't like an animal. It was just very off. but it sounded almost like there was a deer screaming constantly. Then there was nothing. Silence. And we just laid there waiting and waiting, but nothing happened. I laid there for what felt like an eternity and was probably the longest I've ever felt like time has went in my life. As I peered up, I could see that it was becoming daylight and the sounds from inside the forest finally come to a slow stop. Not entirely, but a lot of the animals had went back to sleep for the day, or at least those who hunt at night. We then waited for maybe another hour. Then my dad finally said that I'm gonna go out, but I had to wait there. He then slowly and meticulously opened the tent door and peered outside, first by sticking his rifle out. He then got up and I couldn't hear from him again. I could see his shadow and could tell that he was surveying the area. I was so curious as to what was actually out there that I actually went out myself then. I gone through and my dad looked at me, but for a second I think he understood and just looked back again with his rifle. I can now see that it was clear as day. I went to walk up to where my dad was because I wondered what he was looking at, and he told me to be quiet again, and there was a blood print. It looked like that of a very large animal, and it went on for a long way. My dad said that he thought we should follow it, but it would probably be best if I stayed back. I told him that I couldn't, and that if I stayed back, what if it was still around? He said that was true and we both followed. There was also this terrible smell and all the hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up. I didn't know why. Then I looked at my dad and he was doing the same. I just had a really weird feeling that I needed to get out of there as quick as possible. I looked at my dad and he pointed something, and this smell was terrible. My dad looked over down a little hill and made me stop as we went further. As he turned back to me, his face went completely white and he just said, "Let's go." I didn't know why he said this, but I sprinted back to the tent and went to get my stuff. He said, "No, we're getting out of here. No, leave your stuff, let's go." But Dad, what about, no, we're going. We then began walking, and my dad said that, "No, we've got to get out of here." He was walking quicker than me, and eventually we began jogging, then sprinting. The smell was worse. I don't know how this was happening. I'm sure we'd moved further away. "Dad, what did you see? Dad, shh, let's go." We kept on running. We kept on running for what felt like an eternity, until eventually we got back to a road and my dad knew his way back. Just as we were walking though, we heard it again. That strange scream sound. There was no need to talk to each other this time. We both sprinted now and we finally got home. My dad then spoke to my mum about what had happened and made me go into the other room. After a while my parents split and I stayed with my mum. I didn't really get to see my dad much after that experience, and I asked my mum what he had told her and she said basically the same of what I already knew. I did say to her to be honest, as I asked her this when I was older, and she said that's all I knew. He was about to tell me more, but he never got round to it in the end. I never got round to seeing my dad again in a situation where I could actually ask him. He passed away, as this story was a long time ago, but he never told me what he actually saw. Here's some backstory. I went to visit my best friend who moved from Arizona to California. It was from until the end where we got into a fight, resulting in a day cut short from the trip, that things were good. The morning of this, I packed my stuff and took an Uber to the Greyhound and exchanged my ticket for a ride for the day. However, the next bus didn't leave until 4 PM and it was probably only about 10:30 AM by then. I was so upset about my fight with my friend the night before that this 5.5 hour wait was just a little cherry on top of it all. I ended up going to a grocery store and getting a few apples for the trip, then heading back and waiting at the gate where the bus would arrive, and that's when I met Jeremy. He was sitting on the phone talking real loud, and I couldn't help but observe him. He was a mid-30-year-old bald guy with a moustache, wearing a wife beater, weird shirt, crew socks and a baby blue bandana, and he kept rearranging himself. I know you're not supposed to be a judge of people, but I kind of just knew to keep my distance from this guy. So here I am, apple in hand, looking over, and he looks at me and asks me if I'm hungry, to which I respond, "Oh, thanks, I'm actually just looking for my apple." And he says, "I have plenty of candy I don't really even want, just take them." He then hands me some Snickers and stuff like that. I knew right away that he was a little weird, so I put them in my pocket for later, just planning to throw them away when he wasn't looking. 4 p.m. arrives and so does our bus. We get in the bus and the driver lets us know that we needed to stop in another city nearby to switch buses, so we all get off and I head to the line where the new bus is going to be. Jeremy flags me down and says, "Hey, I saved you a spot." I said to him, "Oh, it's okay, thanks." And just then, these two old little Asian ladies are near him, thanking him for saving them a spot and talking to him like they knew him, and he was just as friendly and kept on insisting that I come over. I thought to myself, let's not make a scene, what's the worst that could happen? I go over and thank him and wait for the bus, and he then says, "Do you have $1 on you by any chance?" I said yes and handed him one. He then goes and grabs a Coke and comes back with it. "For you," he said, and handed it to me. I was very clearly confused, and he said, "You look like you could use it." I was a little put off by this, but not too bad. Once the bus started loading us in, I sat down and he came right behind me and said, "Lucky we got our seats next to each other," and took his laptop and some headphones out. Oh, good, I'll be left alone, I thought. I was completely wrong. "Here, grab the other headphones so we can watch a movie together." Obviously I declined, but he kept on insisting even though the internet wasn't working on the bus, so he couldn't play a movie anyways. So he resorted to talking. He asked me a lot of questions about if I had a boyfriend, and I did, and he asked if we were going to get married or weird stuff like that. That was the point where I finally got put off, but had to stay engaged with him so he wouldn't get annoyed at me. He then starts telling me that he was in California taking care of his sick dad, and he was heading to Texas to see his estranged wife and kids. He also told me that he couldn't wait to go back and be a part of their life again, and he really misses them. While he is saying that, he is toying with a little piece of paper he took out of his pocket in his hands, and I glance over to it without thinking. He lifts up the paper and says, "Oh yeah, I met a nice lady, Filipino. We had a very good time last night and she gave me some drinks from her homeland for my trip. Want one?" And I shook my head, no, but he gave me one anyways. It was some weird canned fruit drink, and I told him it was okay, but he grabbed himself one too and said cheers. And then he started going on about this lady and was asking me for advice. Should I call her, or do you think that would make my wife mad? I just started to stare at my drink, thinking how I could get out of this situation and off the bus, and then he says, "Well, aren't you gonna have any?" I opened the can and took a fake sip and said that it was really good or something along those lines. He then smiled at me. When he smiled, I was disgustingly uneased. His teeth were dark yellow and practically black, very, very crooked, and had lots of plaque. It was disgusting. I mean, layers of the stuff all over his teeth. I worked in a dental office, mind you, and those teeth were among the most disgusting that I've ever laid eyes upon. Not to mention, he reeked of cigarettes and vomit. I wanted to pack up and leave him instantly and throw up because this was so disgusting, but I was on a packed bus in the middle of the desert. I didn't know what to do at this point. Then he started asking me if I go to church and told me that he had a special book for me. He handed me some children's Jesus sing-along book and told me it was very dear to him and he wanted me to keep it. I took it and thanked him. I was being short with him at this point because I wanted to avoid his breath. It was nauseating. Cut to many stops later around 10 or 11 and everybody starts falling asleep and so does he, but he falls asleep with his legs wide open and they were rubbing against my thigh, so I sat with my chin to my knees, sobbing softly so he couldn't hear me. I was so uncomfortable and scared because I didn't know what kind of a person he was and I couldn't sit anywhere else because the bus was full. The lights were dim, so nobody was able to see me, but I wish they did, plus I was very close to the back. I cried for maybe an hour before he woke up and started trying to rest his head on my shoulder. He then started mumbling weird words that were compliments and I thought I was hearing wrong, but at this time I still texted my boyfriend about this creep and what I thought I heard him say, and my boyfriend told me maybe I was overreacting, I'd be home soon nonetheless. While I was texting my boyfriend, I noticed Jeremy glancing over at my phone a lot and I kind of saw what was coming. So I then opened the map on my phone and checked to see how close I was and how much longer the ride back would be. And then Jeremy mumbles what I knew he would. "Who are you texting? Let me see." I showed him my map app and told him I was just checking to see where we were at. Jeremy then sits up and starts mumbling again, but a little clearer. "You're so pretty. You're a very pretty girl, you know." And he touched my leg. I was shook at the very least. All I could manage to say was, "Why are you doing this?" And he said, "Because you're so pretty." And he said this while opening his legs more and more. At this point, I didn't even hide it. I just clearly text my boyfriend panicking and Jeremy says, "Let me see your phone, little girl," and ignored his demand, and then he let his head fall onto my shoulder. I pushed it off and he kept on mumbling while he was falling back to sleep. Then later the bus driver stopped and told us that we were at a gas station, so if anyone needed anything. Jeremy is now awake again at this point and given me $100 bill and acted as if nothing had happened an hour ago and told me to go and get us some snacks. I told him I was fine and he said, "Okay, I'll get us some honey buns and drinks, get out." This was my chance. I grabbed all of my stuff and head to the bus driver and told him what had happened, but he said that he wasn't able to do anything technically and I just got freaked out. The bus driver then suggested that I sit with someone else in the meantime. I looked for the friendliest face I could see and there was this really nice looking guy. He looks a lot like my favourite uncle, so I took some solace in him. I didn't even realise I was crying until I tried to explain the situation as brief as possible, but he understood through the panic and told me to sit near the window and he would cover me. I look in the reflection of the bus window to see Jeremy get on and head towards the back, and he notices that I wasn't there and starts looking around frantically for me, and the door closes and the bus driver starts back on the road. The new person I'm sitting next to begins to tell me he thought we were riding together, as did other passengers. They all thought he was either my uncle or just a creepy looking life partner. I cried so hard when he said that because I told him I felt helpless and nobody seemed to care, and he just comforted me when I told him I would be gone and away from this soon. Then eventually the bus finally arrived at the station, and by this time it was 4:20 AM and I breathed a sigh of relief to myself. It was terrible with just that feeling of being trapped. My first job was working part-time at a mum and pop as a pizza deliverer / dishwasher. The shop is within walking distance of my apartment, which I just go to alone. The shop is owned by a foreign man and his 2 nephews, and another friend of theirs. I was the only female in the entire building. At first, The owner asked me to change into my work shirt for the first day. He said could I do it in the freezer. I declined and put it on in the bathroom. He supervised me delivering pizzas and puts his arm around my chair, and then told me to join him and the workers after for some drinks. I politely declined. I wasn't even old enough to buy a drink. He then asked me if I had a boyfriend, which I did at the time and told him yes. He then offered his worker to sleep on my couch because he didn't have a place to stay without even consulting me. I obviously protested and declined. He then also told me that he knew my boyfriend's name, which he did, but I never told him this. As times went on, things only got weirder. The owner would take me out back and scolded me for not pouring bleach into the dishes that I was washing. I told him that you can't stick your hands into bleach. He didn't care. He would take me out after my shift and compliment my eyeglasses and tell me how beautiful I was. I would say thanks, and every time I would just walk to my car and drive home. He came up behind me as I was washing the dishes and blew in the back of my neck, then proceeded to tell me that since I lived alone that I should be careful. He then stated that he knew the exact layout of my apartment because his friends lived there. I told him I had a male roommate and he chuckled and told me that I didn't. That was true, and that he was going to break into my apartment. I was absolutely stunned at this and had 4 deliveries waiting for me to drop them off. On the way out the door, his nephew muttered something about me being a girl. I threw the pizza bags into the car and promptly pulled over, had a panic attack and dropped all 5 pizzas and whatever else I was delivering at the very first house and didn't care. I then went straight home to my apartment, called my mum and sat in the kitchen with a hammer, just for safety. Someone was then knocking on my front door, but I didn't see who it was. I already knew and had a feeling then. The pizza shop called me repeatedly. I left my eyeglasses in the shop and had their pizza bags. My dad went into the store, took the pizza bags back and threatened the owner, saying he has no problem going back to jail. My dad then got my glasses. Months later, I ran into the nephew at my new college campus. He then proceeded to make unending, uncomfortable eye contact whenever we passed each other. Although I no longer work there anymore, I still don't feel very safe living alone in my apartment. So this happened almost approximately 2 years ago, and I almost completely pushed it out of my mind until I was reading some other post here. Anyway, about 3 years ago, my mum and stepdad separated, and her and I and my sister moved out into a new place. It's in a decent neighbourhood. Not like a nice one, but a safe one. It's quiet and it has mostly elderly people and young families. So moving in, I never felt unsafe, and since the incident I haven't either. But about probably 6 months after we moved in, there was a couple of strange occurrences. One night, my mum was out because she works as a relief worker for women's shelters, and the hours are pretty sporadic. So I'm 16 at the time and stay home with my 10-year-old sister to watch her. At like 9:30, I order us a pizza because we're watching a movie together, and hey, I'm a nice sister. Like 15 minutes later, I notice some lights outside of my house were on, and I assume it's the pizza guy, which is a little weird because they're never this fast, but I wasn't about to complain about it. So I get up to the window to just check and see that a small blue car pulled up on the side of the road in front of my house. It then turned off, but the driver wasn't making any move to get out of the car, or any movement at all. They're just staring straight ahead. At this point, I still think that this is a pizza guy, and I'm like, why won't he just get out and give me my pizza? But he just keeps on sitting there. Eventually I realise that this guy is not here to give me a pizza, so I sit back down and just figured that he was waiting to get some neighbours or something. Another 20 minutes pass and there's the actual pizza that then arrives, at which I start to get uncomfortable because I notice that the car is still parked outside my house and the guy hasn't moved at all. Let me explain. It's not like the person was sitting still casually in their car or playing on their phone or listening to music or anything like a normal person would while they were waiting, but sitting straight up with their arms rigid out in front of them on the steering wheel. Additionally, the pizza guy asked me if I knew who the guy in the car was before saying that he had pressed his face up against the window and stared at him as he walked by and approached my door. So I take the pizza and eat it. Eventually my sister passes out and I turn everything off and go upstairs. Every hour or so I go back to check if the car and the man inside are still parked outside my house, and every time they are. And he's still sitting there the exact same way, until I check again at around 2 AM. Now he's moved from the driver's side to the passenger's seat and his chin is resting on his hands. He is now looking out the window straight up the house at where I am. It's really weirding me out at this point. I still don't do anything, convincing myself that I was overreacting. So I go back up the stairs and wait another hour and a half before checking again. It's like 3:30 at this point, and I think maybe the guy is waiting for me to fall asleep so he can break in and rob us or something. So this time, instead of leaving the lights off when I pulled up the curtain to check if he was still there, I turned them on so he would know that I was still up. I also held my phone up to my ear hoping that he'd think I was calling the cops and leave. I didn't actually call the cops because I figured that it's technically not illegal to park on the road outside someone's house, and I didn't want to turn something into a big situation if there really was nothing to worry about. At this point he starts getting out of the car. I thought that he was just getting out to get to the back of the driver's seat, but instead he closes the door and leans against it, putting both his hands in his pockets and just staring at me. I can't see his face because he's looking directly across the road where there's a street light, so only his silhouette is visible. After maybe 30 seconds of this staring, I get too creeped out and pull the curtain shut again and call my mum. She is concerned and says to deadbolt the door, and if he does anything else, just call the police. She then hangs up. Finally, an agonizing 2 minutes later, I work up the nerve to peek out again and he's still just standing there staring. Now I actually start dialing the number for the police, and just as I go to hit the call button, he abruptly looks up towards my neighbour's house and jumps back into his car. I did find out the next day it's because my neighbour opened the front door and looked at him. Apparently he had noticed a weird car guy too. But weird car guy still doesn't leave. He still continues to sit in the car, still just staring straight up at my house, and he does so until 6 AM. I stayed up there the entire time because I couldn't sleep. I don't know exactly when he decided to drive away, but the last time I checked it was 6. Also, looking back, I'm not sure why I didn't continue calling the police. So anyway, finally I go to bed and try to write it off as just a weird dude. For the next few days I spend the nights at a friend's house and just keep busy because it was the summer holidays. When I get home, my mum tells me that every day since I've been gone, a blue car had driven past the house really slowly and then honked the horn, but she doesn't recognise the driver. And when she walks outside to take a picture of the car/license plate, it had driven by 4 times. It sped away. She called the police and reported the weird behaviour, as well as gave a description of the vehicle, and they said that they'd keep an eye out for any other incidents involving a car matching the description. 2 weeks after this, the car is parked outside of my house again, but no one was inside of it, and it sits there until it's towed away, and that's it. I have never received an explanation beyond that the car was stolen over 3 months ago and was from a nearby town. I still have no idea about any of this and don't know what kind of sense to make of any of it. It just creeps me out even thinking of it now. This happened about a week ago. I just decided to share it. I must start by mentioning that my parents separated and live within walking distance of each other. Now, that's out of the way, let's begin. I was going to my dad's house to get a spare Xbox controller as I had a friend coming over and only one at my mum's house. I told my friend that I'd be back in 5 minutes and set off into the night. I assumed my dad would be home as it was 6:30 and he gets off work at 5. I rang the doorbell, no answer. I wait a minute, nothing. I decided to go back around and look in through the back door. As I get into the alleyway, I feel off. I felt like nothing good would come at the end of it. My paranoia just got the best of me and I went back to my mum's house. After my friend saying that I was a scaredy cat, I grabbed a flashlight and my friend went along with me as we approached the alley and turned into it. The light revealed nothing and my friend hit me with it saying that I was just scared. I went in and I immediately wanted to leave, and a quick glance at my friend revealed that he felt the same. We went to the living room and got the controller. The staircase to my room is in the living room. I had turned the flashlight off but felt an overwhelming compulsion to shine it in at the staircase. When I did, it revealed a man appearing to be in his 20s with yellow teeth smiling back at us. He was, I was assuming, 5 steps up the stairs. I wanted to cry, I was so scared. I wanted to run, but I was frozen in fear. My friend, bless this moron's heart, nonetheless shouted, "What are you doing here?" The man's smile faded and he motioned for us to come closer. What the hell? We both thought. We ran out the door before shouting for help. One person stepped out of their house with a handgun, but the man was nowhere to be seen, as cliche as that sounds. We called the police and they searched the apartment and, well, searching isn't the best word as they immediately found the man on the staircase leading to my dad's apartment. I have no idea what would have happened if I went down the alley that night. Why was he there? What would have happened if I went alone? I don't know, I just don't like to think of it. I used to do some exploring of abandoned buildings with my friends. Now, I wasn't exactly an urban explorer as you would call it now. I just more went to places when I had spare times with my friends. We didn't have any cameras or anything. Usually, all we'd have on us was a flashlight. Maybe one each. Sometimes we were more stupid because some of the places we were going to were really dangerous. And on some occasions we actually had it where a flashlight would die on us. There was one place that we always liked to explore. It was a place that had lots of large abandoned buildings in it, and there was lots of basements running under it. Now it probably wasn't the best idea to be going through that. What with all the decaying materials, it was probably really bad for us, but I always took caution and care not to touch anything, and so did my friends, so that nothing in the air would be disturbed. As I went to this place, I had 2 other friends with me. I had Mark and I had Paul. These were 2 of my best friends. We normally had another person, Harry, who would come to us, but Mark and Paul were always up for it. When we were exploring this place, we realised how big the site was. As Paul had driven us there, it was almost overbearing. It was odd, it was like a ghost town, but it just looked like everybody got up and left the place. It was just weird. As we jumped out of the car, I made sure that I had the flashlight on me and my backpack. All I would carry on me was my flashlight and some water. I always knew that even if I got lost there, I'd have my two buddies with me so I wouldn't have to worry. As we went, we realised how big the place was, so we decided that we would first explore all of the buildings on top, then we would explore what was in the basements. So that's just what we did. We started in the first building, but it had a warning asbestos sign on it, so we made sure that the other buildings didn't have it and none of them did. This building looked a lot older than the others, however, so we weren't too worried. So we all went into the first one and went up the first flight of steps. And when we got up there, we couldn't believe what we had found. It looked like there were tons of homeless people living in there, but nobody was there, and it looked fresh and recent. The thing that was really creepy was there was all blood markings on the walls, but again it was so fresh, it looked like it had happened the day before, but we were the only ones there. There were no cars or anything, and this place was kind of nowhere, if you know what I mean. And it'd be quite hard to access and find, so I couldn't see exactly where all the homeless people would have went when they weren't up here. Then I just thought to myself that, hey, maybe they just moved on. It would be kind of hard to live here, and the stairs are all dodgy. We decided that it would be best for us to split up and explore how we wanted, because we all wanted to go separate ways. So I went off on my own, back down the steps, and walked up to the largest building there. At first I tried the doors, but they just wouldn't open, so I had to stop and break into a window. I made a lot of noise doing so. As I was in there, I heard one of my friends laughing, trying to scare me. I shouted back to them. I told them that they should just meet me down in the basement because that's exactly where I was going next. Only thing was, how do I get there? I walked through one corridor with all the walls decaying. It honestly looked absolutely incredible. It was very beautiful in a way. It's hard to describe unless you actually go to these places, but you almost appreciate them and how they stand now. As I went through one hallway and opened a door, I heard a rabbit run behind me. I wanted to look back at it, but I couldn't see anything, and I decided that I should carry on. As I did, I found a big room with machinery, and it was very large, but it was dark at the same time, so I had my flashlight on. Honestly, if that thing had given out to me when I was in that room, I have no idea how I would have got out of there. I don't even think your eyes could have adjusted to the darkness just because of how dark it actually was there. I thought my friends had definitely heard me say about meeting them down in the basement because I heard somebody say something that sounded like yeah back at the time. So I began looking through the rooms and found some steps that were different to ones that I thought I'd seen earlier. I went up to the first ones and I had the fright of my life when I heard the rabbits again. Oh, these are scary, man. Either that or they're just playing pranks on me, I thought to myself. I then went to investigate the steps and it just led to a maintenance room. I decided again it wouldn't be best to go down there. As I looked back at the other steps, it led down to the basement. Yes, this is sick, I thought to myself. This is exactly what I wanted. And although I was a little scared, I went down on my own. I reached the bottom and the place just stunk. It didn't just smell like the other buildings though, it had a more organic smell to it. It was disgusting to say the least. As I went down there, it became apparent that in the long hallway, people had been there before me. I couldn't tell how long ago, and there was that blood again. Because it was getting kind of cold and I wanted to see my friends, I decided that I needed to just go and find them. So I called out for the name and all I heard was the scurrying of rats. As I turned the corner, I realised just how big this complex was underground. If you didn't know better, you would have said that it was bigger down there than it actually was on top, and to be honest, that might have been correct. You could just see endless miles of tunnels going everywhere. As I walked through one corridor, I explored some rooms. Yep, definitely homeless people living in these. I know, I should go up one and try and prank my friends. That'd be great, that'd scare the life out of them. My torch began to flicker and I almost had a heart attack, but I just knocked it and it come back to life. Now I'd almost be certain that I wouldn't be coming out of here again if I got lost and my friends couldn't find me. Because not that many people knew we were there. The only people who really knew was us. We didn't bother telling people about where we're going to explore because usually it's so sporadic. As I went to look on further, I suddenly got a really cold chill across my body. I didn't know why it was so cold. It was even colder than where I'd been before, but it kind of didn't make sense because if anything, all of the basement should have been at roughly the same temperature. I also got this weird feeling and I started to feel the hairs on my body stand up. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I was a little paranoid at this point, but I decided to press on now. Jogging, I could constantly hear the rats moving and other things. I knew that it was my time to get out of there, so I then began to jog. I knew that I needed to just get out of here. Then, after running for a few minutes, I could hear even more rats, but as I stopped, they did. I went to call out my friends' names, but I was met with nothing but echoes. This scared me though, because it shouldn't have echoed as much as it did, being if I thought it was kind of small underground. It was bigger than I had ever imagined. My voice seemed to carry forever. As I did stop though, I heard a strange hissing sound coming from the end just as my voice seemed to make its last bounce off the wall. Yeah, I had booked it at this point. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't need to, because that sound alone could put fear into the most tough person in the world. So I began sprinting as fast as I possibly could, and I was almost certain that the hissing sound was an animal, but my torch also began to die. I was sprinting, but I couldn't find my way out of there. I had to stop for a minute to catch my breath. I had also heard that hissing sound again, but louder. I turned round with my flashlight. I couldn't see anything, and as soon as the flashlight hit the end of the corridor, silence. The rats weren't making sounds or anything. As I stopped though and my adrenaline calmed down a bit, I got that terrible smell again. Not material smell, just a really bad smell. I didn't know exactly what it was. I started walking at this point because I thought it'd be best to save my energy. My torch began flickering at this point and I almost fainted in fear. Luckily there was a little room that I knew I could go and hide in. So I did just that, and I, as quietly as I could, took out the spare batteries that I had. While I was doing so, I heard them sounds again. My heart began racing, so quick that I almost thought it was going to jump out of my chest. I waited and the hissing sounds got louder and louder. Now I don't know if my mind was playing tricks on me at this point, but I heard somebody speaking, but the language was illegible. They weren't speaking out too loud, almost whispering to themselves like somebody who's lost their mind, and the smell got worse. I began shaking uncontrollably. I had to actually put my tongue between my teeth so that they wouldn't chatter too loudly and give away my position. And I'm not gonna lie, I started crying and praying as hard as I could. I began to think that I wasn't gonna make it out of there. Who could that be? I thought I was alone down here. Is it a ghost? Someone trying to kill me, or just a homeless person? Why aren't they speaking sense? Just as I was thinking that, I heard there was even more of them. It wasn't just me down there. There was maybe 3 or 4 of them. They're all speaking in this weird language and the smell was awful. I couldn't even see any lights though. How could they possibly be down there without any torches, I thought. It got louder and louder and I heard them go into one room. Oh my god, this is it, I'm gonna die, I thought to myself, and I fought without trying to fight, but I knew it would have been futile to do so. My fear and thinking ended up becoming an entropy. I realised that my friends were never going to play a trick on me like that, and there was only 2 of them. It couldn't have possibly been them. I was certain they were going to check my room. I couldn't see exactly what happened next because I had my eyes closed, but I heard footsteps come into the room and I was met with an overpowering smell in the same one that I was in. They began whispering again. None of it made any sense. Then I really thought I was gonna die, and suddenly, silence. I didn't hear anything after that. I waited and waited, and I was probably in there for a good half hour, and I didn't hear anything at all. I decided that this would be my only chance to get out of there. I almost was so scared to the point that I had expected everything, so I wasn't as scared, if that makes sense. I decided my only way out would be to go the way that I'd come, so I began quietly standing up, and as I did, I couldn't smell anything. It was almost like the people, the things, the ghosts, whatever it was, had completely gone. At first I was walking, then I'm pretty sure it was a rat I heard, but that was enough to make me begin sprinting. As I dropped something out of my pocket, and I heard a sound behind me. I don't know what it was, but it sounded like a sharp breathing sound or a hiss. Then I heard something running after me, then more. At this point, I was literally running for my life. I sprinted as fast as I could, not knowing where I was going. My flashlight had knocked against a wall and come off temporarily. I started whimpering and crying and screaming out for help. Then I heard the voices even louder. Luckily, as I turned a corner, I just clipped it again and it come back to life. I knew where I was now. I knew I could make it. I began sprinting and sprinting, then finally I got back up to the room where I'd come previously. I was in hysterics at this point. I was sprinting and I heard another voice. I was also met with sunlight at this point, and I jumped through the window that I'd just come from, cutting my arm in the process. As I looked up, I saw my two friends there. They said, "Where the hell have you been? There's people here." They could see that I was in such hysterics and asked me what was wrong, and I said, "Let's get out of here, please." They both just agreed, and we all ran to the car and sped off. I didn't even want to look back, so I didn't. I then told my friends what had happened after I finally started calming down. After I told them, I had a breakdown and they had to comfort me from crying. They said they were just about to come and find me too, because when they were in one of the buildings and they decided to also enter the basement, they saw what looked like four shadowy figures go down as well. So they had no time of force and just ran back out, searching all over for me to get out of there. To this day, we still don't know what was actually down there, or why that happened, or what the intentions were, or just what was actually down there. But honestly, I don't even think I want to know. When I was younger, I lived and grew up in a very small house that was very secluded. I literally mean that we didn't have neighbours for miles and miles, and if you could call them neighbours, that is. We also lived miles and miles away from any emergency services. That means that if we ever got into any real trouble, then we were really in trouble because it takes so long for whoever to arrive. And that also made family visits very hard. Where we lived, we regularly experienced storms, and sometimes it would flood the land around us, but not too bad. It was always accessible though, because there was one big main road. Our house wasn't in a field, but there was lots of overgrown grass around us. It was literally impossible for us to maintain because there was just so much of it in the land around us. The lightning and thunderstorms that we regularly had would never concern me. Me and my brothers found it very cool, and we loved looking out the window to see the lightning. The only problem was sometimes the lightning got very close to us, and where we were the only thing for miles apart from trees, it meant that lightning could sometimes strike close to us. I remember the closest that it ever got to us at this point was a few miles away, and it started a small fire. But because it was so far away from everyone, it took a while for them to put the fire out. If it was during the summer, it probably would have engulfed our house eventually. It was a pretty scary thought now, but when I was a kid, all I cared about was the lightning. So we were having a storm one night, and my parents were out. They had went out to eat dinner, and they trusted us to be left alone. It probably wasn't the best idea, but we were so far away from everyone that we didn't see a problem with this. As my parents left, they said that I was in charge, me being the eldest, so I didn't mind. What we did was just watch movies for most of that night. We actually decided to watch horror movies because with the lightning and thunder it seemed like it just made it a lot more engulfing. It was almost like we were actually there. I loved that, but my younger brothers found this scarier. After a while we decided to order pizza because my parents were out and they left us with some dollars so we could get it. The thing that we found so funny about all of this was that we know there was no chance of them getting to our house in the time they said, so that would mean that normally always we would get a free pizza. Well, our parents wouldn't let that happen if they were around, but when it was just us, we didn't mind doing so. This also left us with spare cash that we could go and spend. It's not like we live close enough to spend it though, but on the odd occasions we got out, we loved spending it. The storm was only getting worse, and to be honest, I got a little scared at one point. During one of the lightning strikes, it seemed like the power had went out for a second. Just as I got up to go and see what was wrong, it come on again. As the power did go out, it became almost pitch black. I know our eyes didn't have enough time to adjust, but it was still creepy. My brothers screamed as this happened, but I told them just to calm down because there actually wasn't anything wrong. I was a little put off though, because I was honestly thinking that the lightning was going to hit us because it sounded so close and loud. There was no time between the rolling of thunder and the lightning strikes. We all counted and grew more concerned as the lightning was getting closer and closer to us. Anyway, after the thunder and lightning seemed to almost pass but was still in the distance, we'd gone back to watching our films. We were all really enjoying this when suddenly there was a knock on the door. Pizza's here, I thought, and I got up, but just before I did I decided to peer out the window. Both my brothers went hiding. I thought that was weird, but one of them told me that there's a man there and he hasn't got pizza. I was very concerned by this, but I really wanted pizza and I thought maybe they just couldn't see it. So I cracked the door open on the chain that it was on so nobody else could get in or out. What do you want? Have you got the pizza? Listen, you've got to help me out. The lightning struck my house and it's just about to set on fire. Fire? Go and call the police. I don't want to help you, sorry. And I closed the door. And just as I went to sit down, I saw the weird man walk back onto the path and beginning to set off. He took a really weird direction though, because it was towards the wooded area, and that would have meant that he would have been walking for miles and miles, but I was more annoyed that he wasn't the pizza guy than anything, so I decided that it would be good just to go and sit back down, but also called the pizza place to make sure they were still coming. So that's just what I did, and they were. The lightning and thunder seemed to be getting even closer than it was before now, almost like it was coming closer to us. As I looked outside I could see that it began flooding a tiny bit. I was getting worried that my parents wouldn't make it back, but I felt so responsible being the only elder one in the house that I wasn't even worried. I just thought they'd be back in no time. I didn't really want them coming back because I knew that way I was going to have to share the pizza with them, and that's something I really didn't want to do. As we were watching the films, we heard a weird sound outside. Now we weren't quite sure what it was. It almost sounded like somebody calling. I was a little paranoid at this point, so I went up to the top part of the stairs and looked out a window. I couldn't see anyone, but then I heard the sound again. It almost sounded like somebody calling for help. I opened up the window to try and get a listen of what was actually going on, and I waited for a while and I couldn't see anything and I couldn't hear anything either. I just thought it was the sounds of the thunder. Just as I went to go back, there was really loud thunder and it actually made me jump. Now at this point I was really unsettled and I grabbed my blanket and went back with my brothers. As we were watching the TV, we realised how dark it was getting outside. It was apparent now how close we were to the storm. Just as we were watching, we saw a big bright flash outside and Suddenly all the power went out. My brothers again screamed, and I was more annoyed that we weren't able to watch the rest of the films. So I got up and went to look outside. I did see a lightning flash, but it wasn't close to us. I looked around and I was worried that there was going to be a fire or something. But after looking, I literally didn't find anything. I just thought that was really odd. I went back up to the window to see if I could locate where the lightning had struck. It was very dark outside, but at this point, my night eyes had set in. Just as I was doing that, I heard a knocking on the door. I thought that it was a pizza guy, and just as I started going down the steps, I could see through a small opening that it was that same guy from earlier. I told both my brothers to stay as quiet and low as they could and act like we weren't in. Then the knocking continued and I heard somebody shout out that, "I know you're in here, open up. It's not like you can run anywhere." I had no idea if it was still that guy 100%, but I was almost certain it was at this point, and I knew that there was no chance that I was going to open that door. I whispered to my brothers and made them both come up with me. They both crept up the steps and he seemed to punch or kick the door and said something that I couldn't quite hear. So I was up there with my brothers waiting and we couldn't figure out why the power had actually went out. Then we heard a sound on the back door. Somebody was trying to get in. I had gone back down the steps and looked round the corner again. I was actually shaking now, and I could see the guy trying to force his way in through the door. Luckily for me, my mum had locked it before she had went out. I went to go and phone my parents and call the police, but the phone was dead. All the power was out in the house. It was just us and him now, with my parents potentially miles and miles away from me, as well as any other help. I started to think to myself that I might not even make it out of this situation, but I had my brothers depending on me. As we were waiting there, we heard more and more shouting. As I looked through, I could see that the guy had some kind of weapon on him. I didn't think it was a gun, but it looked like an axe or something. Oh no, he's going to try and open the door with it. I told my brothers to go and hide under my mum's bed, and I went through into the attic. As I was up there, I closed the hatch behind me. Where I told my brothers to hide, there was no way the man could have seen. But I wasn't small enough to fit in there. I thought at least if I'm up there, if he does come for me or my brothers, I can intercept him, or I can just climb out onto the roof and divert him away from my little brothers. I then heard him once again screaming at this point. He sounded like a maniac. Then, he suddenly went silent. And I heard another lightning strike. I was really scared at this point. Just as that happened, I heard a car beginning to pull up. Oh, thank God, that's my mum and dad. I quickly jumped down to where a window was and looked out of it. It wasn't my mum or dad, it was a pizza guy about to give us pizza. I began banging on the glass as frantically as I could to try and warn him, but he couldn't hear me. What about the guy? He's gonna get killed. I sprinted down and started shouting through the window to him not to come in. I told him to be careful, but he still couldn't hear me. I opened up the door and told him what happened, and he looked more confused than anything. I opened the door and told him to come in and slammed it behind him. My little brothers was now crying up above me, but after explaining everything to him, he looked really concerned and went and grabbed the knife from our kitchen. He then said that it was too dangerous for us to go outside and we'd just have to wait for my parents to return and get help that way. He decided to do a quick search around the house though, looking through the windows, making sure that he definitely wasn't here, and he wasn't. He kept on looking towards the back though, almost like he'd seen something, but every time I asked him, he said that he had no sight of him. We waited for what felt like an eternity and my parents finally showed up. He ran out and put the knife to the side and explained everything that happened. My parents looked very scared and my mum instantly got in her car and went to drive to the police station. My dad got another knife and they both went out looking for him. As they were doing this, I stepped outside too, And as I did, I could see that there were no lightning strikes, but almost even more scary was the fact that the power cable to our house had been cut. After a long search, they both come back with nothing, and my mum eventually returned with the police. The police then launched an investigation and search to try and find him, but they never found a sign of him. And that was also the last time that I ever saw that weird man. I don't know what would have happened if the pizza guy didn't show up and scare him off. I'm just thankful so much that he did so and acted the way he did, and he probably saved our lives. The following is a night shift that I'm never gonna forget. It still gives me nightmares to this day. I used to work security at a place where we would go to abandoned buildings and just try and protect them at night. We never usually had to do anything because just our presence alone would scare off people from going, but we were mostly there to protect the buildings from vandalism from people before they were going to get restored or converted. I didn't mind working this job because it did pay quite well, and at the time a lot of my other friends didn't get anywhere near the same money as me, and even though you're up there on your own a lot of the time, it was still kind of fun. I would usually just patrol the areas or buildings. Now I had another friend who done this with me, Mike. We actually met through the job. Now Mike was a lot more paranoid than I was, but I could sometimes be overly confident, but this one experience changed that forever. We were working the night shift in a large abandoned hotel. It wasn't too old, it had been modernised. Well, the building itself was rather old, but some of the equipment in it was kind of new, like it had a functioning elevator and other stuff. It was a very large complex, and that meant that most of the time we'd be just patrolling it on our own with our radios. The biggest problem that this created was that as we got further and further apart from each other, our radios would fail. Not only that, the walls were so thick that we would never be able to hear each other. And the basement, oh god, don't even get me started on that. Even though I was confident, it gives me chills every time that I think about going down there. I had to go down there quite a fair bit when I was working on this site, to be honest. I'd have to say the worst thing about this hotel was that there were a fair few broken windows, meaning that it could get very cold. Now this story took place during the winter time too, so it was absolutely freezing. In fact, even though the basement was cold, sometimes it could be quite nice just to go down there because it would even be slightly hotter than above ground, if that makes any sense. I don't know, the whole thing was weird. But anyway, we started off this night shift like normal. We both patrolled together on the bottom of the site and then walked around the area. It was good just talking to each other, and obviously we felt a lot more safe with the two of us being there. We did have a car, but we weren't really allowed to use it, so we didn't. Plus we didn't want to risk running out of fuel or anything. After surveying around the area, Mike started telling me some stories that he had heard about this place, saying that it was haunted and you can hear voices. I just looked back at him and said that, you know none of them are true, right? He looked back at me and said that, yeah, but do you actually know what this place is like? Do you know how many people have died here? Died here? This is a hotel, man. Nobody's died here. Stop it, you're making me feel scared and paranoid. He nodded his head at me and we just continued on our search. We didn't find anything, so eventually it was time for us to part ways because I would have to patrol one half of the site while he patrolled the other. We were still within radio range for most of the time, but as we got further and further apart, our radios wouldn't work. We continued talking as we split up, just to see how far our range was, so we both get an idea of even how far away the other guy was by how much static would appear. And we continued doing so, and eventually, like we knew, they cut out. As I was walking into the first building, I got chills like I've never had before. I was almost certain that this was because I have never been away from Mike in such a scary location, but I started to wonder if it was something else, and becoming paranoid, all them ghost stories started to play on my mind that Mike had told me. I stopped it and just started to think positively, and my mind eventually calmed. As I was walking on the first floor, I did hear some noises above me. They almost sounded like footsteps, but I couldn't be sure because I couldn't really hear properly. As I was walking through, I found a seat and decided just to stop for a minute because when you work like we do, your legs can get really tired. So I sat there and tried Mike on the walkie-talkie, but I didn't get anything. Just as I was sitting there, I realised that it would be very hard to get back to Mike if I needed backup. I was very worried about homeless people sneaking in at night time because that's when they would usually appear, so even if we hadn't seen them on the patrol earlier, there was still a very good chance that they could have snuck in. I started to get paranoid about the footsteps I'd heard earlier, but I decided just to sit still to see if I could hear them again. I did so for about 10 minutes and I heard nothing. So I got up and started walking towards the steps that led to the next floor. Now, as I got to the next floor, there was a cold breeze again that hit me. This time I could see what it was. It was a broken window, but it was still unsettling to me. As I began walking, my radio started going off. All I could hear was this strange static sound. It was a very odd sound. It didn't sound like anything I'd heard before, and I was almost certain that I heard a voice during this, but I just turned off my walkie-talkie because it was just scaring me, and I knew that the chances of Mike being on my side of the site were very unlikely. There was also the elevator shaft that was causing a breeze that I didn't like. With the faulty electronics, sometimes it would go off on its own, but I had never had that happen on me, but Mike said it had happened to him once and it terrified him. He literally ran out of the place because he said there was no reason for it to go off on its own. It was almost like somebody had pressed a button. I just told him that it was a faulty electronics, but looking back at it, even I started to wonder. So I continued walking and flipped my radio back on again. The static picked up again and I heard somebody say my name. I knew that it was Mike now, but I only heard my name being called. I turned off the walkie-talkie again because the noises are very unsettling it makes when it's just out of range, and it's creepy just hearing an odd word. Again, there was nothing on this floor. I just stood there, waited a while, didn't hear anything, so I began walking further this time. I made it to some steps that led to the top part. Just as I went through the door to them and closed it, I swear I heard a footstep sound again. I had tested my radio to try and talk to Mike, saying that I have possibly got an interception, but there was nothing. If I heard him earlier, then he had went further away, so out of range of me. The walls were very thick in this place too, so you couldn't always hear each other well, or they wouldn't go through at all. I started walking up the steps and I heard a phone ring. I stopped for a second, but just thought to myself, how could a phone be ringing? It's no one, it's just faulty electronics, right? So I walked up the stairs cautiously with my torch in hand and opened the door, and the ringing kept on going. Then, almost on cue as I got up there, the elevator doors opened. This really creeped me out. I'd heard stories about this happening before in this place, but to see it yourself, now that's really scary. I stood there with my flashlight trying to make sure that nobody else was around me and the telephone stopped ringing. I went to go a bit closer to it because I located it in a small room, but just as I did, it sounded again. It was almost like somebody was trying to call me. At this point, I was certain that Mike was doing it to annoy me. I heard the static on the radio again and a voice, but I couldn't quite make out what it was. So I went up and decided to answer the phone. I picked up the phone with my hand shaking and said, Mike, this really isn't the time. Mike? I then heard a voice say that it's too late for you now. Then the phone was put down. I dropped the phone myself too and heard Mike talking on the walkie-talkie saying that he was almost certain that people were in there. I was literally petrified and I heard the elevator make another sound. I eventually got enough courage to begin walking and I went straight through to the fire exit. At first I was in so much shock that I literally couldn't do anything other than walk, but then suddenly my adrenaline kicked in and I began sprinting down them. I started sprinting to where Mike was and I heard him on the radio again saying about people being there. I didn't know exactly what he said, but I didn't have a chance to reply because I saw him running straight towards me. I then went to speak, but I couldn't get words out and he said, "It's okay, I know." And we sprinted towards the truck and got out of there. I finally managed to speak to Mike, but I was struggling to get a sentence out of me. He told me that he had seen about 5 people all going onto my building and that he tried desperately to radio into me about what was happening, but he didn't get a chance to. It's needless to say that we called the cops after that. They did a search, but I quit the job that day and I never heard what actually come of it. When I was younger, I loved going to my grandparents' house. They had lived in the same house for a long time. I always liked playing there with my siblings and they would make the best food. So this was somewhere that I spent a lot of time going to. One problem that they always had though was the sound of mice below the floorboards. It almost seemed like no matter what they did, how much poison they put down, you would always hear the mice eventually. This was something that happened over the years and it gone on for so long that eventually my grandparents stopped caring. As they got older, unfortunately, their memory started to go as well, and we ended up moving them to a place a lot closer to ours. One sign of this was that they would eat or take food, then forget that they'd even done so, and start complaining when they couldn't find where it had gone. Now, my grandma always told me stories about how she heard things in the night. She was very religious and believed in the paranormal, so even I was a little worried that maybe their old place was haunted. And my grandpa also said the same thing. The thing that's really weird though is that my grandpa didn't believe in any of that, and he was a very strong skeptic, but even he was convinced that the place they lived in was haunted. Not only that, they would go away and when they come back, items and things had been moved. Now, I'm pretty sure that I even had encountered one of them at one point, because I was sleeping over one night and I heard the mice in the floorboard because I was sleeping downstairs on the couch. But I was very tired, but as I opened my eyes, I almost swear that I had seen somebody. Just as I got up though and eventually turned on a light, it was like they had vanished. After hearing about this, my grandmother got very paranoid and wanted to have the house blessed to try and get rid of whatever it was. And even if I did ever stay there, it was kind of weird because just knowing that something was wrong there put you off from ever trying to get a good night's sleep, especially having to sleep where all the activity seems to go on. Now, one thing that I was definite of was that somebody had definitely moved one of my phones that I'd left there, because when I was staying there once, I left my phone and we went out for the day, but as I come back, it had moved. Not only that, it almost looked like it had been used or something. It was very odd. We went to go and check the mouse traps and, as always, they found nothing, where we'd lifted up part of the floorboard to set them down. It almost seemed like something we were always doing, but it was hopeless that we'd ever catch anything. My grandparents eventually got some pet cats to try and deal with the problem, and also because my grandma believed that they could sense if there was a spirit present. The only problem was that the cats would act really weird all the time when they were left alone. It was almost like they didn't want to be in the place, and eventually we decided that it'd be best if the cats just stayed with us because they seemed so uncomfortable, and it almost seemed as if they were absolutely desperate or hell-bent to actually get under the floor or something. It was really weird. Eventually my grandparents both passed away and we had to sell the house, but that wasn't the last that we ever heard of the place. One day we were driving past and we could see that there was the police doing an investigation over there. We didn't know why and we were concerned, so we went up to them and asked them what was going on. And then we saw some police officers coming out with what looked like a homeless man. The police officer then went on to explain to me that the current owners had reported some strange sounds and things going missing, and after an investigation there was a homeless man who'd been living under the floorboard there, and he had been living there for years too. The following story happened as I was a child, and it's one that I'm never gonna forget. It's not so much the tragic side of the story, but another reason altogether that I remember it. When I was a child, I absolutely loved living in my house like I did. My mum was very caring of me. She was an only mum, so this made it very hard for her to raise me because my dad left us and I only had 2 grandparents still alive. This meant that my family was very, very small. Sometimes it even scared me when I was younger because I honestly thought that as I was going to get older I wouldn't have anyone to be with. Now, when I was younger I also didn't have many friends at school, so that left me alone for much of the time. And moving schools all the time didn't help with this. Being so lonely would mean that I would almost always just be left to play on my own. My mum was concerned about this, but there wasn't much she could do because I had pretty bad anxiety at the time. I would usually just go and play in the garden. Now, there was a lovely sweet old lady who I sometimes saw at the back of our garden. She said that she come from the house opposite. She would bring me stuff, and she was always so nice to me. I would pick her flowers and give them to her. I always spoke to my mum about her, but my mum never knew what I was going on about because, I don't know, she just always gave me a concerned look when I said about her, but I know she was real because I always saw her. I lived in this one house for a few months, and at first I didn't see anything of the lady, but after a while she started showing up. Now, at the time my mum was concerned that I had some kind of mental illness and was very worried in taking me to the doctors because I kept on talking about this lady and others that I would see. Some of them were imaginary friends that I had, but the lady, she was real. The doctors were also left stumped as to why that I was always talking about this lady, because from the tests they ran they couldn't see that anything was wrong with me, nor was there an illness that was causing it. Well, not specifically a mental illness. I did have a bad flu at this time. Now, as I was left bedridden, as a result of the flu getting worse, I started to hallucinate slightly. I would see cats' heads at the walls and objects moving on their own, but when I went back to them, they didn't go anywhere. Where my bed was situated, all I could do was basically watch out the window. Thinking of it now, it was probably the reason that I had imaginary friends, because I was just lonely. People always tended to leave me alone at school. So I would be sleeping in my bed and I would see a cat head in the corner of my room. I'd call to my mum and she would go there and there would be nothing there at all. So my mum decided that she was going to call the doctors. As the doctors come round, I explained everything to them and we began to talk. But as that was happening, I saw the lady. I didn't quite catch her name, but I always saw her. She was watching over me from behind the doctor and my mum. I was more focused on her than I was the doctor at the time. She was just staring at me with some kind of meaning. It was very odd, but almost comforting at the same time. I could see that the doctor was now looking at my mum rather than me, then back to me. Then he said that if you don't take this boy to the hospital right now, he's going to lose his mind. I didn't really quite catch it because I was still focused intensely on the kind old lady. She just smiled at me and nodded. Then they all left the room together. A few days later I was admitted into hospital. This was to get me over the flu, but also so that they could watch my mind, or monitor it should I say. Now while I was in here, I was again very lonely, but I enjoyed the company of the other nurses who always took time to talk to me and play with me. They found it sad that nobody come to visit me while I was in hospital. So I was in the hospital one night thinking about things. I was really struggling to get to sleep, but this was obviously as a direct result from my flu. I knew this. It kind of dwelled on me a bit that I was kind of lonely, but I thought to myself it doesn't matter. Just as I was laying there, I had a visitor come. It was the old lady. She came to me and said, "Don't worry, everything's gonna be okay." I just smiled at her and she then left. I never bothered telling anyone about it because I thought it was just nice that she come to visit me. I was in that hospital for a fair amount of time and eventually was let back home again. More than anything, I was looking forward to seeing the kind old lady because heck, she was the only person that I had. So I went back to playing in the garden like I normally did and I waited and waited, but she just wouldn't show up. I couldn't see her no matter what I did. I kept looking back at her house. That was when I noticed that it was more old and deserted than I'd originally thought. I kept on leaving flowers for her, but day by day went by and she didn't show up. Eventually I stopped seeing the cats' heads as well, and I also stopped seeing her. That was just as I got over the flu. Now my mum sounded very happy when I told her that I was no longer seeing that lady. We were having some problems though outside of that. I didn't know why, but my mum was just so stressed out with work. And I guess she was really struggling looking back on it now because she was the only source of income and she had to start caring for my grandparents. One day, I was left to be in the house alone while my mum went to do just that. She didn't mind leaving me there because we were so far away from everyone else that it shouldn't have really been an issue. So she left and I was left to my own device. So I just did what I normally did. I started reading, played a little bit in the garden, and looked for that kind old lady. I decided that I should eventually go to bed because there wasn't really anything better for me to do. I just started to drift off and I woke up in almost a panic state. I called for my mum but there was no answer. She wasn't back yet. There was no way that she could have got back that quick anyway. I didn't know what had woken me up though. It was very odd. Just as that happened, there was the old lady again. "Oh, you're here again. How are you?" I said happily. This time, she didn't say anything to me, she just looked at me and stared. As well as the warm feeling that I normally felt when talking to her, I also got this panic again. She finally opened her mouth and said, "You need to go." I was left more confused than anything. I turned around to look out my window to try and get a rough judgment of how late it was. It was pretty late, but just as I looked, I saw some flames from outside. I turned back to go and tell the lady and she was gone. It didn't make sense how she could have disappeared that quickly. I instantly called for my mum and her and I got no response. Something was telling me that I needed to get out of that house no matter what. And I did. I sprinted down, ran outside and didn't take a second to look back. I finally got far enough away from the house where I would be safe when I turned back and the whole place was up in flames. Literally the entire house. It would have been more sad to me, but I'd moved places so many times I didn't really think too much of it. I just waited out the front for a while. Eventually, my mum showed up and somebody had called the fire department for me luckily. While most of the firefighters ran and took control of the situation, One came to me and said that, "You know how lucky you are to be alive." I said, "Yes, I know," but I said, "Can you please make sure that the old lady isn't there?" "What old lady?" he said. I said, "Just go quick, you need to save her." And he also rushed off there. Eventually my mum turned up, and my mum couldn't believe what had happened. She was just so happy and relieved to see me, but I was more concerned about that kind old lady. As I was waiting with the fire department, they took me to a further distance as the flames were getting much worse now. My mum was still crying. We ended up going to the side of our house and closer to a hill. As we were waiting there, the fire department squad came back, and their leader said that they have almost put the flames out now, and said there was no sign of the old lady, and he just looked at my mum and she given him a funny look and they walked off. When he come back, he was saying to her that he understood and that I was very lucky to be alive. Then I looked at my mum and I said, "What are we going to do now?" She almost started crying again, but she looked so happy. She said that she just got a very good job and we weren't ever going to have to worry again about money. I was very happy by this, but at the same time I was still concerned about that lady. As I was sitting on the hill, I turned back round to look at the house. Well, I thought it was a house. It was the old lady's house. But it wasn't just abandoned. You could see that the whole place had caught on fire. I then looked at the fireman and asked him if that place also set on fire too. He said that it didn't. Apparently their department had dealt with that fire 40 years ago. It was a very bad fire and sadly an elderly woman lost her life in it, but nobody's ever been there since. When I was 19 years old, I had hit a dating rut. Between college and work, I wasn't able to put much effort into meeting new people or forming new relationships. I'm female, by the way. My best friend at the time had just recently married, and with no dating life as herself anymore, she decided that helping me find the right guy would be the next best thing. I wasn't even that interested in dating at the time. I just wanted to finish my basics and transfer to a large university. However, she insisted, and I gave it a chance, and she asked if I was alright to give this guy she knows my phone number. I'm very wary at this point, until she begins begging. She pleads about how handsome this guy is and he's 25 and has a stable life. She then goes on to tell me about his well-paying job and the house he built himself and the ranch and the horses he owns. She glorifies him as much as possible, stating that he's sensitive, caring, attractive, put together guy. But I know no one is this perfect, so I ask, what's the catch? He only has one leg. Now, that in of itself is not a problem until she says he accidentally shot himself in the leg and it had to be amputated. I look at her like she just said the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. I explain that I do not think I want to date someone who mishandles a gun so badly that they shoot their own leg off. But after all her begging and pleading, I cave in and I begin chatting. I can't even remember his name right now, so let's just call him Steve. The first couple of days of us texting went okay. He was charming, funny, and it was easy to keep a conversation going between us. He had a slight arrogant tone and bragged a bit, if I can excuse it. I mean, if I had my own house and a high-paying job at 25, I think I would be smug too. He had made a few comments that sent up a warning flag, like how when he discussed meeting in person, he talked about wanting to wait for a while before we met, and that before we met, he would like to see me in public, but like me not see him in public. He wanted me to go to a public place where he would go then observe me without me realizing. Now that's some creepy stuff. I told myself I was looking too deep into the situation and that I needed to really give this guy a chance. But on the third day, more specifically night, he suddenly decided things weren't moving fast enough. He began asking inappropriate questions like my experiences and what my deepest, darkest, hidden secrets were. Just really, really weird stuff. I began kind of scared at this point. It was just weird. I expressed my discomfort and I said that we've only known each other for 3 days. He then backed off and began a really big guilt trip on me. And by that time I didn't really notice. He manipulated things like, I didn't mean anything by it, I just want you to trust me. I don't want our relationship to be normal, I just want us to be open with one another. I just want to be that one and only person that you trust your fears with. Another day/night of this, and I very stupidly told him one of the darkest and scariest things that I'd ever experienced. I never tell anyone about it. I won't even name what it is in this story, but he immediately sympathizes with me and assures me that he feels the same. I immediately feel regret and try to change the topic. He keeps trying to bring it up again and I explain that it's not comfortable for me to do so. I don't think I should have told him these things because it was too soon. I explained that I wanted to take it slow and then he agrees and changes the topic once again. We started talking about his home and his ranch and I asked him to send pictures of his house that he built himself. He immediately starts sending me photo after photo of his house and all the ranches with the horses. For a while it's no texting, just pictures one after the other. He then slipped in a photo of himself exposed. I immediately interrupt with, "What the hell is that?" He then asked if I liked it, to which I reply with a big fat no. I try explaining how inappropriate that is and try to understand why he thought it was okay to send that with no context in random photos. He gets irritated and says, "Just damn chill, stop freaking out." Excuse me? What do you mean? I proceed to blow up and we get into a really big fight. I contacted the friend who set us off and explained what has happened. She tells me that Steve has also contacted her and that he was calling me foul words and saying I was psycho. Then me and my friend agree that I should just ignore him and end the conversation with him. This completely frustrates him. He begins threatening not just me but my friend too. He says that he's going to kill us and our whole families and we will be sorry. We just ignore it until finally he recites our home addresses to us. We pay good attention after that. Now I never told him what city I lived in or anything like that. I asked my friend how exactly she knew him and she said that she kinda lied and didn't really know him that well. She used to work with him at a local mall and apparently this psycho was a customer who shopped there and one day she just randomly asked if he was single, then if that he might be interested in me. I proceeded to go crazy. She didn't even know this guy, but he still somehow knew our names, our parents' names, our siblings and our telephone numbers and location. We immediately took screenshots of everything and he says that he's not doing anything and we inform him that if he doesn't stop we're going to involve the police. Of course he continues with threats and my friend's mum is the secretary of a lawyer, so after reporting Steve to the authorities and blocking him, we took the situation to my friend's mum and she took care of it. I don't have exact details but I never heard from him again. When I was little, I lived in a very safe neighbourhood. All the neighbours were friends or relatives of friends and this begins in the late 80s when we were allowed to roam and play as free as we wanted as long as we were back before dinner. The scariest encounter I can remember was with this creep was when I was around 6 years old. I was with a group of other kids riding bikes down the steep hill that led into our neighbourhood. One of the older kids noticed that there was a man standing against a fence at the top of the hill, not far off from a parked blue van. I didn't recognise him, but that didn't mean anything at the time. I had only just been allowed to leave the yard and assumed I didn't know everyone in the area yet. I don't know why, but We all went over to him. I'd been told to stay with the group, so I followed along behind my friends. Now, I don't remember much about him, only that he seemed to pay an extraordinarily large amount of attention to me. Even after a lot of the other kids had wandered off to go and get their bikes and stuff, he kept on talking to me. I remember very clearly how he would ask about my age, and I told him. He smiled and said I looked much older. I guess he thought that I was going to take this as a compliment, but I don't know, it was just weird. I was aware of how much younger I looked and was, compared to everyone else, much younger. I didn't even have a bike at the time because I was too small to even be able to reach the pedals. I don't even know if he creeped me out exactly, but I quickly excused myself and rejoined the group. I think I felt like more insulted than anything, like he was making fun of me by pointing me out and that I didn't really belong with the group of mostly teenagers. Eventually, I went home and didn't really tell my parents about the man. Keep in mind, he was an adult and I wasn't allowed to question adults. Stranger danger was never very much of a thing with my family. Now I'll skip 3 years ahead. It was Christmas. I was 9 years old and I'd finally been given my very own bike. It wasn't a little kid's bike either. I was so proud of it. I had to go out and try it out despite the cold weather. Of course my parents didn't mind this. Had spent about 20 minutes rocketing down the hill on my cherry red bicycle and got wiped out at least once, skinning my palms. When I started to notice a blue van driving by slowly and repeatedly, I didn't remember the previous encounter with the man with a blue van. Like any 6-year-old, it was completely coincidental at the time and I quickly forgot. The van drove down the road past the drive into the neighbourhood at least 3 times, and I had this strange feeling like a tingling down my spine, as if someone was watching me. I'd never had this feeling before in my life, and the only way that I could describe it is that it's a very primitive warning that you're prey and you're now in a very dangerous situation. Luckily, I was able to keep my cool, and I kept on riding and watched the same van drive by slowly back and forth at least a dozen more times. Finally though, when it passed me for the last time and disappeared behind the trees, I booked it down the hill, using gravity as a bit of a strength in my legs to build up enough speed to be able to get me all the way to the end of the drive and then into my yard without stopping. At the time this was quite a feat because my house was the very last one. I ditched my brand new bike in the grass and ran inside to safety. That's how scared I was. Again, I didn't tell my parents because I felt like I was being silly, and half because my mum was cooking and my dad was watching TV. 2 activities that were never to be interrupted in my house. After that, I never saw that blue van again. I didn't find out until I was 29 exactly how lucky I was. After my father's death, I helped my mother clear out his house. I found a box with an old answering machine, a bunch of tapes and a tape player. Knowing the narcissist my father was, I assumed they were a combination of old messages from nearly 3 decades ago, and him singing and playing the guitar, which was bad and even worse respectively. I took the whole thing home and listened to the tapes, mostly for nostalgia. I was right, but they were not just missed calls from friends and family. I was not prepared in any way for the absolute filth that was on those answering machines. I am not one to blush at bad language, and I thought I may not use some of the words I hear myself, but it doesn't bother me when others do, but this made me sick. Maybe because it was directed at me, as a child. There were entire 1-hour tapes filled with this one man calling repeatedly, saying polite sounding variations of "this message is for" and the following name. If you could let her know, I'd appreciate it. Then nothing but graphic descriptions of what he planned to do to me, step by step. Then he said how that he was going to leave me somewhere that my parents could find. He called me his girlfriend and said how pretty I was, going on about how I looked and stuff like that. It was just disturbing. The message stopped abruptly right around when I was 10. After that, it was nothing but the usual missed calls. I didn't know whatever happened to that man, but he really didn't sound like the kind of person to just give up. Maybe he ended up in jail or dead, but I do know that my dad had a tendency of handling things himself. I know of at least 2 other incidents when someone was bothering me or my mum, and they stopped after he went in to have a talk with them. I also, looking back, suspect my father was a genuine psychopath in a clinical sense. He was also a sniper once upon a time. I destroyed those tapes because I didn't want my mother finding them,